Welcome back to the Green Crescent 5th International Congress of Technology Addiction. I would like to make the following announcement for the participants who just joined. For English or Turkish interpreting, there is a button at the bottom of the screen. For the English, please click on English. For English, please click on Korean. Now, I would like to introduce the second speakers of our Congress. Our second keynote speaker is joining us from Switzerland, is Professor Joel Bilix from the Center of Excessive Gambling, Addiction, Medicine at Louisiana University Hospital. He also conducts studies in the Institute of Psychology at the University of Louisiana. Professor Bilix is here to deliver his presentation titled Conceptualizing and Diagnosing Gaming Disorder Without Pathologizing Healthy Gaming. Mr. Bilix, sorry if I pronounced wrong, sir. Welcome to our Congress.
It's Bilieu, but it's complicated. It's perfect like this. Thank you very much.
What's the correct one?
Bilieu, but don't worry, everyone is saying it that way. It's perfect.
Okay. Is it okay, Mr. Bilieu?
Okay, can you hear me? It's okay?
Mr. Bilieu. Oh, perfect. Welcome to our Congress, sir. It's a privilege and big honor to see you here. Now I leave the floor to you.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's an honor for me to speak at that conference. So I would like to thank the organizer for giving me that opportunity. And thanks for introducing my talk. So I will be speaking about the diagnosis of gaming disorder, but also the importance of considering and defining what are healthy gaming patterns, because when we speak about gaming, we speak about one of the most popular laser at the worldwide level. So everyone is involved at some degree, or almost everyone is involved at some degree in gaming. So this is an important issue in terms of potentially pathologizing normal behavior. So this question will be central in my talk. I have no conflict of interest to declare in relationship to what I will say today. I just have to disclaim that part of my slides have already been used in previous conferences. I will quickly, because it has been addressed comprehensively by John Saunders just before me, but I will just remind some key facts related to the recognition of gaming disorder. So as you may know, first and back in 2013, there has been a proposition of considering internet gaming disorder at that time, and it was included in section 3 of the DSM-5. So at that time, it was considered as a condition that need further studies or research or evidence before a formal recognition of the gaming disorder. And more recently, in 2019, as you know from the previous talk, gaming disorder was included in the Icd-11. And without entering too much into the details, I want to remind that inclusion was fostered by a different type of evidences, including a corpus of data that shows that excessive involvement in gaming may produce negative consequences for health, for psychological health, physical health, and also can interfere with the daily life, so cause functional impairment. And among these data, there are also longitudinal data. There is also an increase in the number of treatment-seeking cases. So people who arrive in consultations or specialized treatment program for seeking help to deal with problematic gaming symptoms. And if you look in the scientific literature, you will see that there are more and more research reports which include a large sample of treatment-seeking cases. And it's not only from Asian countries. It has been said in the past that it's mainly something that concerns East Asia, but this is definitively no more the case currently. And there is also a public health perspective that has driven that recognition, because at some point, if a condition is recognized, it helps, for example, to implement systematic prevention or information strategies and actions. It also helps to obtain research grant to better understand the etiology behind the condition. And this is examples of the public health perspectives. These arguments are developed in the paper I have reproduced here at the bottom of my slide, if you are interested. I will not enter into the detail of the clinical features of gaming disorder, because it has been done in detail by John Saunders just before this talk. So just keep in mind that there are these three guidelines: impaired control over gaming. Gaming takes precedence over other interests and daily activities. That there is a continuation of gaming despite the occurrence of negative consequences, and that all of these features have to be combined with functional impairment, which means an incapacity to function in the daily life with tangible negative consequences. So in the last years, there has been debates. Typically, people have opposed to the recognition of gaming disorders. And in this slide, you have examples of opinion papers or debate papers produced by people who were against the recognition of gaming disorder in ICD, and by people who have defended the position that, for example, for public health perspective, there is a need now to recognize pathological gaming as a condition. This is another example. If you look at the literature, you will see a lot of this type of debate, opinion papers, arguments, pro, con. So I would just take the opportunity to come back to the initial criticism that have been done to the recognition of gaming disorder. And this letter that opposes the recognition of gaming disorder has been published at the moment where the beta version of the ICD-11 was available online. So before the World Health Assembly in May 2019 has recognized officially the gaming disorder, there has been already available, the ICD-11 was available as a draft, beta draft, temporary draft. And at that time, there has been the first opposition to its recognition or to its legitimacy as a mental condition. And among the main arguments were that the research basis and a substantial part of existing research was grounded in what is called a confirmatory approach, and I will explain that later. And a second claim and important claim that was made is that the recognition of gaming disorder as a mental condition is a risk for pathologizing healthy gaming patterns. And there are also be some claims that we are facing a kind of moral panic that can be compared, for example, to what arose in the past with rock and roll, comics, and other new media or new activities. I will mainly here address the two first points that are in red. And for this, I need to come back to the initial conceptualization of internet gaming disorder. This is the one published in the Dsm-5 in the section 3 for not yet recognized condition. And if you look at the criteria here, you can see that they are mainly transposed from substance use disorder. This is basically the criteria that were used at that time to define substance use disorder. So there is here nothing that is really unique, for example, to problematic gaming. So how did we get to that initial proposition? And here I will explain what I mean by that confirmatory approach. So basically, this approach consists in reusing criteria or research that has been found useful in the context of substance use disorder and applying it to excessive behaviors that are not related to the use of a psychoactive substance. And this approach has been consistent in a large amount of research in the field of behavioral addictions. This is not necessarily problematic, but that can be problematic in some cases, and I will try to explain why. So basically, there are three steps in this confirmatory bias. The first one is kind of a priori hypothesis based on a symptom level analysis that an excessive behavior has to be conceptualized as an addiction. For example, a gamer that displays some apparent loss of control over the behavior, that a game to regulate moods, or who is very preoccupied by the fact of gaming, thinking to the next episode of gaming, remembering the past one, being very preoccupied by that behavior. And as a first step, and it has been, you can find that in a lot of research, there is this a priori hypothesis that it may be an addiction, which is fair. It may be an addiction, of course. But then tools are developed that measure addiction. What I mean by that, I mean that these tools have been created just by replacing the term, for example, alcohol in a questionnaire by the term gaming. But you can do that with something else like sex, sport, or what you want. So in a third step, research is launched to identify if those scales, which have been created to measure addiction, are related to known risk factors for addictive behaviors. So typically, impulsive personality trait, impairment in executive function, or decision-making, or those kind of things. And it's not surprising if you design a tool that measures addiction, that when you correlate it with instrument measuring known risk factor for addiction, that you will find those links. And then you have a kind of self-perpetuating process where you will confirm your preliminary hypothesis without confronting it to other options. So this is some of the consequences. Typically, there has been an overlooking of potentially alternative etiological models. And for example, it can be obsessive compulsive disorder or impulse control disorder or simply dysfunctional coping. In a number of patients that we are seeing, the gaming symptoms reflect kind of coping that is displayed to face social anxiety. For example, if I come back to the question that has been raised in the previous talk, this is an example. There is another relying on the symptom level, and again, the underlying processes and typically psychological processes tend to be overlooked. There has been also an excessive focus on the similarities between behavioral addiction and substance addiction, and a neglection of the dissimilarities or the potential unique features of this behavior. And you will see that from my next slides, but in some cases, this has resulted in an over-diagnosis with prevalence rates that reach numbers that are not credible, like 10 or 15%. With such numbers, we are not measuring a pathological behaviors. We are measuring something like a normal behavior in society, or an extreme but not pathological one. And a last consequences is that from this approach, we use treatments that function in addictions, substance use disorder, and apply them to behavioral addiction. In some cases it works, but not necessarily in all cases. This is a typical approach that has been heavily used in the field to create new addictions. And if you look at the literature, if you look at the scientific literature, but it will not be my aim today, you will find that a lot of emerging potential new addictive behaviors, from workaholism to sex addiction, dance addiction, and a lot of things have been created based on such approach from the component model of addictions. These models basically, it's more a list of symptoms than a model actually, but it states that there are 6 features that characterize addiction. And I will not repeat them because you probably know them and they've been presented in other contexts. And what is important, if you, for example, Griffith would say when he presents that model, that all of these features have to be present. And this is a very important point that is often made by Griffith, but that is unfortunately ignored by a lot of people, meaning that a lot of scale are created, for example, without taking into account that the 6 components should be present to have an addiction. But anyway, you have to consider that approach, symptom-based, have been used to create a lot of new addictions. And if I come back now to post-research, but very interesting one by Charlton and Bedford more than 10 years ago, having used such a model, so such symptoms in engaged gamers, so people who are highly involved in video gaming, this research have shown that some of these criteria are linked to negative consequences and functional impairment typically. And this is the one I have displayed here in red, like withdrawal, relapse, and conflict. But also there are other features such as salience, tolerance, or mood modification that are not systematically or very weakly related to these negative consequences that resulted from gaming. So from those body of research, Charlton and Dunford claim that we have to distinguish high involvement, but potentially healthy, from a pathological involvement. And the problem here is that if you follow those approach of the substance use disorder criteria and apply them to behavioral addiction, you may be faced in a situation where you use criteria that are not necessarily valid to diagnose a mental condition. And of course, this may create overdiagnosis. This echoes to some psychological models, and I have used here the model of Robert Vallerand from Canada, where his model states that there are different types of passions, and some may be harmonious and not interfere with daily life, while they allow to fulfill basic needs such as social affiliation, power, achievement. And this is very important, especially in those ages of the COVID, because of course, more and more people are gaming, and this has been underlined by John Saunders. But for the majority of these gamers, gaming can be an activity that can be well integrated in the life and that is able to fulfill basic needs that are not necessarily be fulfilled by other activities, especially if you are facing a lockdown. So it's why we need to be very cautious when considering those things. Of course, there is a risk, but there is also opportunities. And such models have been applied to different online behaviors beyond gaming. And even the last work here is by Marc Potenza, who will also speak today. It seems that even certain form of online porn consumption can be done in a way where it's integrated and not causing negative consequences, even at relatively high level of consumption. So can I just ask the chairman how many time I have for the rest of my conference so I can adjust? No, if not, I will use my inner watch, sorry.
10 minutes.
15 minutes, perfect, thank you very much. That's what I need. Okay, so I will come back to relatively old data. This is on World of Warcraft. This game is still popular among some people, but less lower than 10 years ago. World of Warcraft, typically, when we come back 10 years ago, it was the first patients that arrived for gaming-related problems. A lot were playing to that game. So I will just show you a study which highlights that we can have high involvement without necessarily having negative consequences. And in that study, we have asked engaged gamer to complete a few self-reports. I will not enter into the details, but we have also measured in-game behaviors because these data are available from the official website of Blizzard, who has designed the game. So if a gamer allows you to follow his main avatar, you can see what he is actually doing online. So this is a screenshot for the armory where we have taken some of the ecological data. So what is interesting here, and this is the only result I want to point in the study, is that we have computed a longitudinal analysis for, so it's a regression where we wanted to predict the progression in the game. So we have computed indices of game progression, but I will not enter into the details. I have no time. If you want, I can send you the study. And what we showed is that the increase in the rating and the quickness of this increase is not predicted by addiction symptoms, but rather by some other factors, including motives or guild affiliation, which means that you can be highly involved and progressing well in the game without having necessarily problems related to the game. So this is an evidence of high involvement. I will not enter too much into the details, but as you know, there is also the rise of esports, and we don't know that much until now regarding esports, but there is a kind of paradox because there has been claims that we will face more problems because of esports and the popularity of esports, and that esport gamers will have probably a risk to develop gaming disorder. But there is a kind of paradox, because if you compare esport to a sport, then if you look at the research made on professional sport players, they tend to have good executive functions. And executive function is a key for being good in sport and in competitive sport. And this is also a criteria, something that is impaired in gaming disorder. So there is a kind of paradox here, and we need more research on that specific topic. It's why with some colleagues, including Daniel King and Damien Brevers, we have launched this special issue about esport in addictive behaviors, and we encourage you to submit there if you have research on that topic. So I will finish now the talk by presenting a study that has been also mentioned by John Saunders just before. That's the Delphi study. So we are in a moment where there has been some debates regarding the criteria or even the recognition of gaming disorder. So what we wanted to do was to conduct a Delphi, which is an expert agreement regarding the validity of the gaming disorder criteria. And we have done that mainly because in the field, there has been groupment of people either against or for gaming disorder, but not really a structured approach and to try to get a representative sample of experts. And this is what allows the Delphi review. So it's part of an European project, the cost action. And so our aim was to follow a structured approach and to use transparent criteria to ask in a representative sample of experts what are are the used criteria valid or not to diagnose gaming disorder in order to refine his diagnosis. And we wanted to embrace an international perspective, which was not always the case in previous studies. So, not entering into the detail, this Delphi technique has been more and more popular the last years, including when it comes to find consensus on mental health related topics. And the main approach is the following. If you are an expert, you will receive an online survey which will ask you to fill a series of questions. And here the questions relate to the gaming disorder criteria from Dsm-5 and Icd. And you will have to rate if you consider these criteria relevant or not. And at the end of this initial round, the research team will collect all the data and will decide if there is a consensus or an absence of consensus for each of the criteria. And for each of the criteria for which there is no consensus, then there is a second round, and we will ask again the expert to re-rate the criteria, taking into account his or her past answer and the answer of the other expert. So there is this iterative processus, and there is rules to determine when it has to be stopped. So here, the experts were designed as people having research and clinical experience in the field of gaming disorder. And in some cases, to answer an international representativeness also, we have considered people with extensive clinical experience, but lower research experience. So we had a list of 200 experts. Finally, we have selected 40. We have used a pre-screening to ask, for example, about the clinical experience. And based on the pre-screening, we have removed 10 experts and included 30 experts in the Delphi. So this is the representativeness of the expert. In mean, they have worked 8 years with people having gaming problems, and in mean, they have published 20 papers on gaming as first or last authors. So what we wanted to assess, and this is the crucial point, the DSM-5 EGD criteria, the ICD criteria, and we have 3 questions for each of them. First, clinical validity. Do people arriving for a problem of gaming present that criteria, that feature? Then clinical utility. Is the feature useful or valid to distinguish high involvement from pathological involvement? And the last one is the prognostic value. Is the criteria an indices of perpetuation or relapse of the disorder, for example? We use the Likert scale for each of these questions. And there is either an inclusion consensus or an exclusion consensus. When, for example, 80% or more of the experts agreed that a specific criteria is relevant, then the criteria is kept and not used in the next round. And we have a similar exclusion criteria. And when both are not met, then we have to re-rate so the criteria is included in the next round of the Delphi study. And there is some rules to determine where there is no more move in the opinion of the expert, and then we have to stop. The details, statistical details, are in the paper. So in that study, 3 rounds were necessary. And this is the kind of feedback you have as an expert. For example, this is a question about escapism. You have here your previous answer, here the answer of the panel, and then you have to answer again. Either you align to the panel or you stay with your answer, but you have to justify. So now, with my approximately 5 minutes, I will explain the result of the study. So regarding the DSM-5 criteria, you can see here in green the criteria for which the experts were in agreement that they are valid, typically unsuccessful control, continued use despite consequences, putting into danger relationships or work were typical criteria that were judged clinically valid, clinically useful, and having a good prognosis value. But there are other criteria, typically tolerance or deception, that were judged as irrelevant, yet they are part of the DSM-5 definition. This is an important point. And other criteria, such as withdrawal or preoccupation, there were no consensus. So I would say, at least before considering them, we need more research. Interestingly, if you look at the Icd-11 criteria, and this has been shown by John Saunders, the picture is more clear, and only loss of interest has been mentioned as clinically valid, but there has been a lack of consensus regarding the prognosis value and the clinical utility. It's unsurprising to see that these three Icd-11 criteria globally correspond to the Dsm-5 criteria that were judged valid. So this is encouraging results regarding the fact Icd-11 definition will not pathologize healthy gaming. There has been an opportunity for the expert to mention criteria, additional criteria that were not included in Dsm-5 and Icd-11 definitions. And when a number of experts mentioned them, they were included in a subsequent round of the Delphi. This was the case for these three symptoms, but finally they were not kept. The only one who was shown clinical validity was the health consequences and typically sleeping problems. Okay, so what are the implications for diagnosis? And these will be my conclusions. It's hazardous to recycle, to use criteria such as preoccupation, tolerance, or mood management, to diagnose behavioral addiction, in the current case, gaming disorder, because they may be conflate, so mix high but healthy involvement and problematic involvement. And the use of these criteria in the past research may explain, for example, why we have found unrealistic prevalence rate of 5 or 10%, depending on the sample, probably because in those prevalence rates, there is a mix between the highly involved gamer and the problematic gamers. These arguments are explained in more details in that paper. Implications for assessment. This is a study by Dan King, which regroups the screening instruments that have been used for gaming disorder to date. And here you can see, if I use the result from the Delphi, that almost all, if not all, existing tools mix criteria that have been found as useful and criteria that have been found as irrelevant, which is a big problem in terms of assessment of gaming disorder. And this is why, for example, there is currently a process at WHO to develop new tools to measure gaming disorder, because there are important issues with, I would say, most scale in that field. And finally, this is my final slide. There is a need to shift from what I called in the talk symptom-based model from a process-based model. And I applaud that initiative from Matthias Brand, Elisa Wengman, Mark Potenza, and colleagues, who have developed perhaps one of the first models which clearly consider not only the symptoms, but also all the underlying processes to promote research in behavioral addictions. Of course, this is known from ages in the field of substance use disorder typically, but as I have said, a too important part of research in behavioral addiction is using a very superficial approach and not consider these important processes like cognitive distortions, executive mechanism, cognitive dimension, affective dimension. And here you have an account that take these things into account, and previous research should be anchored in such approach. So the take-home messages, and I will try to be quick because I think my time is over. There is a need of considering functional impairment, especially when it comes to laser activity and non-substance related excessive behaviors. You have to remind that existing approach, typically DSM-5, mixed potentially valid and non-valid criteria. And this is important to keep in mind because, for example, they have already been used to conduct national-based epidemiological studies. There is a need to distinguish passion from addiction. There is a need to embrace process-based approach and to improve their assessment of gaming disorder. I would like to give my special thanks to Jesus Castro Calvo from University of Valencia, who has managed most of the work in that Delphi study. And I would like also to thank the organizer, and I remind the hospitality of Green Christian Society back in 2017 when they hosted and participated in a WHO meeting. So this is very good memories, and I regret to be only a cyber self here. So, oops, my last slide is in French, sorry. Do you have questions?
Yes, thank you for your inspirational presentation, Mr. Bilu.
Perfect.
I learned too fast, huh? Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, before we start the Q&A session, I wanted to something remind. And first of all, there are many questions asked. We try to ask some of them only. And one more thing, as you may know, we have just 5 minutes for the Q&A section. So I need briefly answer, please, Mr. Bilu. Okay.
I will do my best.
Yeah, thank you. Let's start. Our first question is monetization, spending money, considered a criteria for hazardous gaming?
It's the increased monetization of gaming is a real problem. It's increased different type of risk, and it means that a lot of young people are confronted with the opportunity of gambling at very young ages. Because if you look the ages for video games that include elements of gambling, it's like sometimes 6, 7, 8. This is very aggressive marketing approach. I think this is one of the most important risks and a challenge for the next year to regulate this convergence between gambling and gaming. But I will stop here because I think it's an agenda for an entire talk this afternoon. So you will have probably a lot of details in those talks.
Yeah. My second question is, what do you think? Is there a relation between clients' personality and the type of the games they choose?
Of course, there is very different motives that drive people into video games. Typically, there are people who are gaming for achievement, others are gaming for role-playing, others for teamwork, competitive play, immersion, escapism. So, and the different type of games, for example, MMORPG, like World of Warcraft, MOBA, like League of Legends, or Battle Royale, like Fortnite, they may fulfill different motives. So, of course, your personality will drive you into different types of game because these various games fulfill different needs. But this not necessarily means that they will promote, for example, a problematic or a pathological use of those games.
Okay, and my last question is, it seems like describing behavioral addiction is harder than describing physical addictions. How do you think about it?
Yeah, it's really, thanks for that important question. I think it's a challenge to be able to diagnose correctly behavioral addictions, also because they concern behaviors that are not necessarily unhealthy, which is typically not the case with alcohol. Drinking alcohol is anyway unhealthy, which is not the case of gaming. So this raises challenges. And perhaps it's very obvious, but the first characteristic of a substance addiction is a substance. So a substance has a direct impact on your brain in terms of neuromodulation of certain aspect of your brain, which is not the case of behaviors. Of course, repeated involvement in behaviors will also have implication for your brain. Or of course, when you play a game, you will have reward, so it will activate reward system and all these kind of things. But there are important differences that translate into the way we have to conceptualize and diagnose them, and it's really a challenge. It's also a challenge for other activities like sport, work, a lot of things that are often considered as addiction, but also sometimes opposed. And I will have to inhibit and to stop, otherwise I will speak too much. But
yeah. I think all the audience, all the people have to observe themselves very carefully. And if they want to change some addictions, they need to get some challenges, huh?
Yeah, and loss of control and negative consequences should be probably the two key words to identify a problematic behaviors. And things like preoccupation by an activity is probably less important, because if you have an harmonious involvement in an activity like dancing, gaming, something else, of course you will be preoccupied. Of course you will experience desire that may resemble craving, but this is not necessarily problematic at all.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mr. Bilu. It was a pleasure and a privilege to hear your presentation in this Congress. Thank you so much.
The pleasure is mine. Thank you again, and it was a pleasure for me too.
Have a good one, sir.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. We would like to thank Professor Bilu for this valuable presentation now. I would like to direct some questions from the participants. Actually, I ask my questions. I wanted to some information about the Congress, how it's going right now. The Congress will continue with our invaluable speakers and further knowledge. Throughout the 1 hour lunch break, high school students from Istanbul and Izmir will present their papers on technology addiction. Firstly, Zehra Miray Düstaş and Asude Güvener from Hüseyin Avni Sözen Anatolian High School will present a paper titled Youth Perspective on Social Media Use. Secondly, Ahmet Keçeci from Valdeba Science High School will present a paper titled Youth Perspective on Gaming Disorder. And finally, Ertuğrul Tunç from İnönü Anatolian High School will present a paper titled Struggling with Technology Addiction Through Technology. If you would like to join these presentations demonstrating our youth support in struggling with addiction, it will be so precious to appreciate their efforts. Let's witness their presentation together. During this 1 hour lunch break, you can also watch some of our interactive materials of the distance learning system, learning management system, LMS, being a part of addiction prevention training program of Turkey, TBM, designed for preschool, primary school, secondary school, and high school students. I wish to see you all again at 1 p.m.